Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from www.englishwithkirsty.com. Here I'll be sharing with you tips, information and other learning resources so that you can improve your business English. And welcome to episode 205 of the English with Kirsty podcast. And the last thing that I said was that I wanted to get episodes to you more regularly, and I had intentions to do that, but the problem was that I got the flu in January and I lost my voice for a while, so I didn't want to record a podcast episode while sounding like that, so it took a bit longer. But I'm back and I want to do a solo episode today and talk about something that has come up several times when I've been talking to clients, and that's about using translators for emails, because a translator being something like Google Translate or one of the online tools for translating blocks of text. So not just individual words, but the whole email, and just sticking it in the translator and then sending out whatever comes out of it and hoping that that will be okay. Because I know a lot of the time it's easier to write a language than to speak another language on the telephone, for example. I spent a long time hiding behind emails and messages when I started learning German. And although learning Romanian, I pushed myself a lot harder to speak, because that is the thing that I always struggle with at the beginning with a new language. Sometimes it's still easier to write a message than to actually talk with someone. But so I understand there are a lot of reasons why it's easier to send an email, because you have time to think, you have time to check things, it's not as spontaneous as a conversation. So all of these things make sense. But a few times recently I've heard people saying, oh, well, it's okay, it's easier to write an email because I can just get the translator to do it and that's a job done, that's fine. But I just want to show and highlight a few reasons why it's not as simple as that. There are some arguable use cases for translation software. They're minimal, but they exist. And there are some ways that they can be used. I'm not saying they're terrible and we should never use them, because I use them as well for certain situations. But there are some things that I think people overlook when they see this as a really simple issue and oversimplify what's going on. So that I think the main reason why people do that is because they want to make a good impression. But I think anyone who's translated something into another language then back into their first language knows that sometimes some really odd things come out of translation websites. I think the most bizarre one I ever saw was a golden retriever, the dog breed, and I love golden retrievers. You can see one on the podcast page. And the translation for even something as simple as that came out as a retriever that has been constructed out of gold, or has been made out of gold. It just still makes sense, does it? That's not a golden retriever. It's not all that bad. Some things are okay, but generally the impression that you want to make, you could be making a bad impression in a different way if you rely too much on translated text, because it will introduce mistakes into the English that you probably wouldn't have made yourself. And the more text you give it, the more opportunities it has to make a mistake, which brings me on to my next point. So if you're writing something in English, or if I'm writing something in Romanian or German, which are my additional languages, I don't start with the English text and translate it, because that's harder. I write what I can in the other language, and then I check it to do my best to make sure that it's right. But I don't start by having a really complicated text in English, or a text in the way that I would normally speak in English, because that's guaranteed to be longer. And if you put what you would normally say in your first language into a translation website, there'll be a lot more words, and probably words that you don't need to make the point that you want to make really clearly. And so the translation software translates all of that information, and there's more room for error then, because there are probably more words than you needed to start with. Whereas if you started in the other language, you really focus on what are the main points, what do I really want to say in this email. And if you really trim it down like that, then there's less room for error, and that's another reason why translation software can be problematic. If you just feed in whatever you would say in your first language and hope that the results will be good. And that's another thing that there are mistakes that you wouldn't have made. It's they're very good. Sometimes it's okay, but I think we've all seen texts on the internet that a machine did it because something was translated too literally, because there are expressions that we use in one language that just don't work in another language. They don't make sense. And sometimes translation software is aware of that and will put things in a different way, but many times it isn't. So that's another reason that if things are translated too literally, or if things are said in a certain way, like with greetings or how you begin or even how you end a message, they can sound a bit bizarre if you don't know how it should be done in that particular language. Another thing is that there's not such a good understanding of the tone. So what's polite in one language, and is that polite, too formal, too informal, just odd if it's translated word for word into the other language. So you can translate words, but the idea behind the words, the tone of voice, the contracts that we become familiar with because we know how language works, that doesn't always come across well if it's translated automatically. I think one other really good reason for doing this is because people can tell. We're just not at that stage yet where you can't tell the difference, because if sometimes I can see that my clients or potential clients have done this and I read the email, usually I understand, sometimes I don't, but I can tell that translation software did it. So my point is that they can help you, but it's not an easy solution. You can't just rely on them to do your job for you, because you will introduce new problems, probably new mistakes into the email, and that will possibly create further problems for you further down the line, because there may be misunderstandings or just something that wasn't very clear because you use the translation software. So I use them. I use sites to, for example, if I want to know how to conjugate a verb in a certain tense. There are verb conjugation sites as well, but sometimes I just stick it in a translator, because things like that it's harder to get those wrong. So if I want to conjugate a verb, if I want to check the plural for something and I'm not sure, I might use it for that. If I want to check word order, but then again that is more tricky, because the longer the sentence is, the more room there is for error, but there are times when it can help you with that. And if you want to check how something, like if you're using a different kind of tense, I've already mentioned that, but if you aren't sure how to, some languages change the way they conjugate verbs in certain tenses, so there's only really one right answer for that, so it's harder to get it wrong. But as soon as you start introducing more complicated ideas, it becomes less useful. So here are some things that you can do instead of relying too much on the translator. I'm not saying don't ever use them, because I've just said that I use them in certain situations, but here are some things that you can do instead. Firstly, I touched on this a bit earlier, but don't translate a text unless there is a really good reason why you have colleagues in a different office and they have to get exactly the same message as the colleagues received who speak your native language. Don't translate from your first language. Write the text in the new language first, because it will be much simpler. Translating your own text from one language to another is harder, especially away from your first language into another language. So don't translate, because then you won't have an overly complicated text to start with. If you're in a company where other people are using English as a communication language, look at how other people are writing the kind of thing that you want to write, and is there anyone there that does it well? I'm not saying you should copy their work or copy what they do, but you can be inspired by people who are a bit further down the the road of learning than you are, or if there's somebody that you know writes very good and very and emails that are very easy to understand, who writes correctly, you can be inspired by them. I think there are times when we should ask if we need help. I certainly don't ask every time I need to speak to somebody in another language, because that wouldn't be appropriate, and it wouldn't be the best use of my time. I do have someone who works with me on Romanian content, and if there's something that's important, if it's going on the website, if I'm doing some marketing in Romanian, for example, then we work on it together, because I need help with that. If I'm just replying to a message that I've received from somebody, I will do my best. It won't be 100% right, but I can't ask for help with everything. But if it's something that a lot of people are likely to see, like a page on my website, then I will ask for help, because it's making a decision for me as a business owner about what's where my priorities are and what content most people are likely to see. So if their first contact with me is on a website in Romanian, I want that to be right, because that's like a shop window for my website. If it's a reply to somebody on LinkedIn, I will do my best and hope that they understand me. But I think it's okay to ask for help. It's not wrong, whether that help is in the form of training, like in an English course, and I do offer English courses, and I do ask for help. I do courses too in other languages. Or it could be help if you're a business owner from somebody who works with you on content. Like I also do that, get content checked and improved by somebody who has that language as their first language, and they can see the things that I don't as a learner. It could just be help if you need help with speaking and with confidence. You could find additional opportunities out of work to speak. For example, I have the Conversation Club, but there are plenty of other things that you can do. And if you want to find out more about the Conversation Club, I'll add the link to the show notes page. It could just be help from your colleagues. If there's something that is important, if you're going to give a presentation or something, you could show a colleague, or you could ask for help. You know whom you can trust, you know who would be appropriate to do that with. But there are times it's not true that we all have to do everything alone. Everybody needs help with something, and maybe it's you feel bad about it, but you shouldn't, because we all need help at some point with something, whether it's language related or I can't think now, but there are lots of things that we need help with. Nobody has to do everything on their own. Another thing that you can do is to make templates. I do this for things that are in other languages, but also things that are in English, because I want to save myself time. And I don't want to be like a robot sending out standard responses. But at the same time, if I get the same question 10 times a week or more, then the answer doesn't change from day to day. So it's okay to have a template, as long as you customize it properly and make sure that it answers the question you've been asked. But there's nothing wrong with having templates. And if it's in another language, you can get someone to check them that they're right, so you don't replicate the same mistakes every time you answer that question or send out that type of email. And the other thing is you can practice writing, whether it's something that you do on your own and you don't share with others, or you can get feedback on the writing. I have a writing course as well. If anyone wants to find out about that, they can contact me, because the majority of my lessons are on Zoom or Teams or something like that. But I do also have a writing course. If writing is the thing with which you're struggling the most, then I do have a writing course for people who want to improve their English. But it doesn't have to be with me. It can just be write more if in your spare time, or spend a bit of time creating some templates that you know will save you time in the future, because you've already created something that will be useful and that you can then go back to and use again. So I don't think translation software is terrible, or translation websites. I think they have a long way to go, and I think you certainly can't rely on them just to feed your emails into them and to hope that the output will be good enough for your needs, as a way to not need to learn anymore, because the quality just isn't there. I think the other time I've used them is for checking things that I've received and don't understand. I don't tend to do it in the languages that I speak, but occasionally I get something on my web form that is in a language that I don't speak at all, and then I have no chance. It's usually spam, but I do want to know, so I'll use it for that. And as I said, there are some use cases for checking small fragments of sentences or pieces of information, but for the whole email, chances are somebody will know if you've done that. So it's better to work on a strategy for making it possible for you to write those emails yourself. And whatever that means for you, it'll be different for different people. But it's not a long-term good solution to rely on them, because there are lots of other good and more useful things that you can do instead. So I hope that's useful. Have a good week. Have fun learning English, and I look forward to bringing some more content to you in the very near future.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes.